All right, welcome all once again to the conversation, hopefully will be a fascinating conversation on disruption and contention and learning from the Black Lives Matter movement in the environmental justice movement. There's some tech tips here and we're just gonna get started. So my name is Sujatha Jesulasan. I'm a professor of management here at the New School. I just joined the New School a couple of years ago. And before that, I worked in various social justice movements, mostly related to gender justice. And for the last 15 years was the founder and executive director of a few organizations. And here at the New School, I'm also the faculty director of the Social Movements and Innovation Lab, where we're exploring just innovative ways to bring about social change. And just to give you all a little bit of background, my colleague and I, Ana Baptista, also a professor here at the New School, we were approached by the Northlight Foundation and asked if we would design a fellowship for the environmental justice movement. And this series of conversations is a part of that and is really to inform the design of the fellowship. So we realize that there's much to learn about how we might accelerate social change and movement level change for climate justice. And this conversation in particular, I'm very excited about, given the visibility and the sort of dramatic changes that the Black Lives Matter movement has brought about in the last few months in particular, but over the last decade, we thought that there was a lot to learn from this movement. And so with that, I am going to do quick introductions for both Monica and Deva, and then we'll go into a series of conversations. And just so folks know, the format of this conversation is we're going to spend about 40 or so minutes in this conversation. And I'll have a couple of questions to ask both Monica and Deva, but really it's also an opportunity for them to be in conversation with each other. We'll take a quick 5-minute break, and then folks we'll break people out into small group discussions where you'll get a chance to talk about what Monica and Deva shared, and then think about the kinds of critical questions that you want to have as a follow-up, and then we'll come back to the main room, have some more conversation, and that will then be the end of this event. So with that, I'm going to go into the introductions, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce Monica Atkins. She is the Director of Organizing at the Climate Justice Alliance. And you can read a little bit of her bio here, but in particular, the things that I wanted to note is that she has been a longtime organizer of both social and cultural events and action that really bring in art and poetry and music into movement work. She has organized things like the Art, Poetry, and Justice Slams and Freedom Summer Marches. She comes to climate justice work with a long history of organizing in unions, particularly United Auto Workers, American Federation of Teachers and Communication Workers of America. And she is a native of Chicago. I myself am from the Midwest, so delighted to have that connection, and a graduate of Jackson State University. And she really brings her passion for the arts into the kind of culture change work that drives and inspires movements. So thank you, Monica, for joining us, and welcome. And as part of this conversation, we wanted to really bring in a very on the ground, somebody who's embedded in communities and brings that perspective to this. And so Monica is going to be repping that. And then our second speaker is Deva Woodley, a colleague of mine here at the New School. Deva is a professor, an associate professor of politics at the New School. And her research has really focused on media and communications, social movements, race and imagination, and political understandings of economics. So really bringing together kind of a wide variety of perspectives and trends. And her most kind of recent projects are books on, one is, it's hashtag Black Lives Matter and the democratic necessity of social movements. And it's on the ways that social movements repoliticize public life, so kind of re-inspire and reinvigorate public life, particularly in this time of despair, but in times of despair in general. And then her second book, and I'm very impressed that you're working on two books at the same time, Deva, is What We Talk About When We Talk About the Economy, an investigation into the American economic discourse and its implication for politics and policies in the post-Great Recession era. So two very relevant and pertinent books, and I hope we hear a little bit about those books in this conversation. So this is a little bit about their bios, and I want to invite both of you to maybe share a little bit as part of kind of our easing into this conversation, what really drives and motivates you? Kind of how is it that you come to this work? What inspires you? And what gives you purpose in the work? And maybe we can start with you, Monica.
Absolutely. Peace, everybody. Thank you for that introduction, and just super excited to be here and having this discussion and sharing the panel also with the amazing Deva Woodley. So very grateful to be here. But I would say for me, what has brought me to this work, honestly, was my mother, a Black woman. I would say she's very passionate about everything that she did, gave 110%. And as you explained, kind of my entry into organizing, it came through union organizing, and it was actually being 16 years old and helping my mother through writing grievances and that process, practicing and rehearsing, and really practicing, rehearsing, helping her to step into her power as a worker. My mother actually passed at the age of 52, so I was about 21, a little bit before 21, so she didn't get to see what she imparted on me, but the things that I would say most that she imparted was, having work ethic, valuing your labor, and having pride in that, which, your hands create and what you contribute to. And so for me, for Black women who have to fight to exist, what my mother's story motivated me to do was build a world where having pride in your work doesn't mean death, but it means, building practices and a world that doesn't, reduce our labor to just a job, but, having work that is life affirming and that, allows us to really use our innate gifts to be in service of the life forms that are around us, the earth, the air, the land, and the other life forms that may not look like us as human beings. And so those lessons, watching her and her struggle, I think is what really motivated me to believe that another type of world, another way of living, and another way of being as a Black woman was possible.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Deva, how about you?
Hi, thank you for inviting me. I'm so happy to be in conversation with Monica as well. So the way that I came to my scholarship on social movements was actually, I was raised in a political household. So, and my parents were both sort of tail end members of the 20th century civil rights movement, a little bit too young to be in the thick of it, but always sort of raised us with a veneration for that and for history in general. And so I was always interested in social movements just as a scholar, right? As a nerd. And then in college, when I was a part of a lot of activism, particularly around the living wage, and also was involved with student publication about left politics on campus, I started to get really interested in how people who are involved in the work of social change value understanding, right? Value public understanding, value the meanings that they make, how they do it and when they don't. And that experience really kind of galvanized me to start thinking about social movements, not only in terms of policy wins, but in terms of meaning making. And that is really what I focus on now. I am really interested in and inspired by the ways that movements shape our understanding of political possibilities but also the possibilities of our lives, right? I think that so much of politics and why it's so off-putting to so many people is that they think that they can't affect it, or they think they can only affect it at these designated periods in time during elections, and really don't think about it as a process of political imagination and meaning making. And I think that when you have an environment that encourages people to understand politics as a method of social change that expands well beyond the voting booth, and is really about imagining the world that you want to live in and then planning how you get from here to there. That's very inspiring. And I just want to uplift that process and scholarship, because the truth is organizers like Monica all over the United States and the world are doing that work. And it's work that we don't study closely enough, because it's highly effective work, actually, and also very impactful, because when you shape people's ideas about their own power, and about what political horizons they can bring into view, it's very empowering, not only for your causes, but also just in terms of people's lives and their own well-being.
Thank you both. So there are two themes that I really heard in both of your bios, or your sort of biographies. One was economics, and sort of the role of economics in what is driving and motivating people, but also this piece around imagination and creativity, and the possibilities of it. And Monica, particularly given your work around culture, I'm wondering if you could just say a little bit more, what role has culture and art played in creating both meaning and imagination and bringing that to light?
Wow. I'm thinking about so many different instances, and I would say one that's really coming to mind. And last year, just maybe last year or the previous year. So there's an alliance that we're a part of, as a member of the Climate Justice Alliance. There are other movements that we build with to continue to try to like build on that impact that our members want to make, and doing that as a collective. And so there was a week of actions, and thinking about the history of like indigenous people and Black and African people, and the ways that those histories are connected. There were tensions within that week where it felt like, you know, I guess you would say relationship wise, and the understanding of where people are on an individual level. But one of the most beautiful things I think that came out of that week was the cultural pieces. We did a direct action in the middle of, we were in San Francisco. So there was the GCAS week of meetings that were taking place where we were outside disrupting, and what culture's role played is in helping us to take space and also bring the things that, the people that were having the tensions the most together and directly in the middle of that direct action. And what it was filled with was song, dance. And there's just a very beautiful picture that we captured of everyone in this circle dancing, and there was an indigenous elder who actually was in a wheelchair, who came out of nowhere and stood in the middle of that circle. And it was just so much beauty. Like the physical presence of culture, I think, has the role of removing fear, removing tension, personal misunderstanding, and really helping us to resolve conflict so that the work continues. And so that picture, when you asked that question, is what came into my mind. So that may have been a roundabout way of saying what I was trying to get to. But visually, even looking at that picture today, it just even just today still sends chills down my spine to look at, because that week was very intense. And we think about our movements and all these different things that we do together for the name of liberation. These tensions, these points of tensions or misunderstanding, where we bring together culture, is where a lot of healing and transformation can take place. And so that for me has been my experience within EJ and even within some of my labor work, that I was able to put, culture and the arts into the conversations and the way we were organized, and we saw more impact. We saw people's, fear of walking into their own power be removed. And so, lifting those things up. And when we say culture, is not just limited to, poetry and art and dance, but it's those traditional things that our ancestors, carry, that we are carrying from our ancestors. So that is down to our food. That is in the way that we, our spiritual beings, and the way that we, use our spiritual traditions to care for the land and steward it. So culture's role, very, very vast, and I could definitely go on more about it.
Just to pick up on something that Monica said, just from the point of view, I think, of scholarship, one of the things, okay, so there's so many things I want to say. So in, in traditional kind of the hierarchy of, ways of being in the world, in the Western tradition since the Enlightenment, it prioritizes cognition, right? It prioritizes logic, it prioritizes things we think of as non-emotional headspace. But the truth is, as human beings, we do not process things only cognitively, right? The things that help us understand meaning are normally not bare logic, right? And in fact, all logic is based on premises which are pre-logical. So that's one thing to sort of get out of the way, that this idea that culture is somehow separate from other ways of learning is absurd. It's just not factually true. The other thing, though, that's really, I think, important for organizers, or the thing that organizers know that we don't often think about, those of us who study politics, is that cultural things, especially embodied things like singing and dancing, those things are things that, first of all, use a different part of our brain than the cognitive part of our brain, and it's a part of our brain that can actually be really resilient. So for example, some of you may know the research on, for example, people who have dementia or memory loss, and how that doesn't affect the songs that they know, and how that you can kind of like engage people, having elderly grandparents myself, like this is a, the way that you can engage people who may have lost some of their cognitive function in a different kind of human process that is still an exchange of meaning and a way to communicate. So that's one thing. Those things are good ways to communicate. The other thing is that it knocks people off of their scripts, right? So particularly in this moment, a lot of people think that they already have opinions, or they already know, right, what they think politically, or that they don't care about politics, or that they know whose side they're on, or, right, like, so we have these scripts that we go back to, and in political science, we call them heuristics, right? They're shortcuts. And cultural things knock us off our scripts, because they give us something new to evaluate and participate in that we don't have preconceived notions about, that also engages a different part of our brain than cognition. So cultural things, particularly embodied things, it's not only sort of like good to include because it's like holistic and trendy, it actually is scientifically a really important part of organizing people, especially if you want to organize them to change behavior. Because in a way, it's the most efficient way to get people to be open to changing their behaviors. So that's one thing that I kind of wanted to say about culture. I also wanted to say, particularly in the movement for Black Lives, people really recognize that joy is a political resource. That when we're organizing for change, it's not just about grievances, it's not just about anger, it's not just about pain. All of that stuff is present and valid, but that joy is also a political resource. And that when, it's another way to sort of like connect with people and lift people up and make them feel in community. It gives them a reason to be engaged in the kind of work that they're engaged in. And I just think that that shouldn't sort of fall out of the conversation either. Joy and celebration are so important, not only to us as human beings, but actually as a political tool.
If I could just add on to that, definitely the joy. And I think that, and when we're talking about like learners too that we're bringing in, like in these from these different movements, like the how you are disruptive is by bringing your joy. And so like just in that example that I gave of like how we were all, you know, singing and dancing in the middle of this circle, at the same time there were police, you know, lined up on the other side of us, you know what I mean? And that was disruptive in, you know, getting people, folks couldn't get inside of the door because we were holding space and doing that, leading through culture. And so that, you know, as we're talking about disruption and contention's role in radical change, like, you know, these are some of the examples of how you lift up resiliency and still be disruptive.
Oh,
yeah, and I've heard you talk a couple of, I'm sorry, Sujata.
No, go for it.
I've heard you talk a couple of times, Monica, about ways that you hold space and are able to do direct actions through song and dance. And I also want to put out there that it's hard to, so many things are criminalized, but song and dance are not criminalized, and also make that connection back to the antebellum period, right, and the period of enslavement, right? Like this is also something that we know from our ancestors, is that so many things are criminalized and not allowed, right, whether they should be or not. But a lot of cultural manifestations are not, right? So it's difficult sometimes for repressive forces, right, for the state to figure out how to deal with,
exactly.
right? Like they can't,
Absolutely.
it's hard to arrest people who are dancing, right? Like
exactly, and singing. You look like the enemy at that point.
That's right. You are the
bad guy. So most definitely.
Yeah. Well, and just to build on this point, and going back to a little, I mean, so in some ways, like there's this really interesting then paradox of like both of you have entered into this work kind of driven by economics and labor, which in some ways in this moment is like seen as like the rational, right? It's like, it's the concrete, the objective, the rational. And then to respond to that and challenge sort of the economics of exploitation and oppression, then with art and culture and singing and joy. Yeah, it just struck me of like how like both the economics and art come together in the kind of organizing that you've done. So just to like build on this a little bit more, and this might seem like a very obvious question, but, and I don't think it's always, I think maybe for some folks it is an obvious, okay. So my question is, what role has race and racism played, both in these systems of oppression that, both in the climate justice context, but clearly in Black Lives Matter, but like how people understand that and how that has kind of inspired and driven, both helped make meaning, but also created possibilities for organizing?
Yeah, I definitely, Deva, did you want to go first?
I kind of had a follow-up to what we were talking about before, but I can kind of segue into it. So I just wanted to say that in terms of at least my process, and I don't know if this is the same way for you, Monica, but one thing that I've learned from this movement, and by the way, the reason I'm working on 2 books is not on purpose. I'm not ambitious. I was working on the other book first, and then the movement exploded, and I was like, oh, like, I better catch up. So that's the reason for both of those things. But the reason that I come to this through economics is because I started asking the question, you know, early on, and first as an activist, but then philosophically, is that like, what is this economic sort of reform for, right? Like, what is a kind of revolution of the way that we, you know, think about capital for? And for me, the answer is to make people's lives better, right? But not just to sort of like make people's lives better in this idea that they have a different dollar amount in their bank account. People should have enough money to live, but the purpose is the living, right? The living part of it is the purpose. And so often we don't think and talk about that. And the living part of it is, right, do you have time to care for yourself, for your dependents, for your elders? Do you have time to cultivate a garden if that's what you want to do, or be in a quilting circle, or have a book group, right? Like, do you have time to, walk, along the earth, right? And sort of breathe and participate in that. And the truth is that, late stage capitalism does not afford us that time, right? Like, all of our time is colonized for waged work. So for me, it's not just about a living wage in a union, although it is about that. The reason that I want that is so that people can live their lives. But that means that we have to be talking about people's lives as well. And that's one thing I think this movement does, which moves me into the race and racism thing, is because race, the phenomenology of race, that is how we're identified racially, makes a difference in how we're able to live our lives. So for me, it's the same thing, right? Like, I am interested in people's well-being. I'm interested in how we create a society in which people can live and thrive. And you can come at that from a lot of different positions, but I think that all of the positions have to have the others in mind. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's about well-being, right? Like, I want a living wage in a union so that you have time to produce your art and your culture and be in community and, lift each other up and, take care of the babies and the nibblings and all of that. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's all the same struggle for me.
Absolutely. All of the things, and like, just, I don't know, you always hit it on the head, so it's kind of hard to, but honestly, like, racism's role is to keep the extractive economy extractive. It promotes, a few people having power, a few people having wealth. The type of, way that it looks at its work is by exploitation of, primarily those essential workers who are Black, brown, and then the way that it governs itself is, by force and militarism and authority. And so, racism in I would say this current economy which we live in, centers white supremacy and all of the isms that erase Black sovereignty, indigenous sovereignty, and the truth about who we are, about who we are and what we're capable of. Deva was just hitting on the point about labor, and want to lift up, my home organization, Cooperation Jackson, in the work that they're doing to help, to really promote for us to really rethink about our labor and what, placing the value of our labor too, like what physical things can we do to meet our needs, like how do we transform our means of production, how we consume, and what those things that we place value on in life. And so building a real economy that is built off of solidarity, that is built off of caring more than it is a transaction. And so racism role is to keep the extractive, and those who are, I would say, that have felt powerless, and keep them in that position of not really walking into their power. Their power, our power.
Can I just say, I want to hear more about this phrase, stepping into and walking into our power. I find that so evocative, and I just want to know more about what that means to you, and what that means to organizers, right? Like, people, there's several, language is my thing. Like, I love thinking about language. And there's several ways of talking that happen in the movement that I think are so interesting, because they do seem to indicate a shift toward care, like you say. Part of what I write about in my book is that this movement has a political philosophy that's based in a politics of care, right?
Absolutely.
They want to just sort of like reorient what we do away from interests and even away from rights and talk about care, right? And I think some of these phrases, right, like holding space, showing up, step into your power, like all of these are like descriptions of politics as acts of care. And I just want you to like talk about what they mean to you.
What they mean to me, like some of the things that you just mentioned is funny because I just came off of a just taking a break and breathing. And previous to that, I went to a training which set us up, and I thought it was going to be about like work and just all these different things. But what it really was about is helping to assess for yourself, like what your personal passions are, what are you, really like why you are here. And, a lot of times I think in organizing, you give up so much of your life, give up so much of your time and those things that are personal passions to you because you're always in service of. And so for me, what walking into my power has meant is like what it looks like for me to be in partnership with people, the people that I work with, our members that we support, instead of being in service of, because the thing with the organizers, I feel like the burnout is real. Most of the time you're working so much that you're not even having that time to care for yourself. And so in those weeks, what I did to walk into my power was literally just take care of myself, sleep, rest, feed myself. But then it is also coming back into movement space and being able to what it's looked like is being able to hold boundaries for that self-care, but it's also boundaries in holding each other accountable to what we say we're committed to. So it's looked a lot of different ways on a person. I think personally for me, it's been being very intentional about preserving myself. And then when it comes to, my work, for me it's meant being patient, being gentle, but also being austere and being unapologetic in those things that may be contentious, and that's what it's been. And so yeah, that's just what comes to my mind off top, but that's what it's looked like for me. And I would say for Black women in particular, in organizing, that's something I have not been able to do. And in all of these years of organizing, this is really the first time that I've really like re-understood my relationship to organizing, and my relationship to, the gifts that I have and how I bring those gifts into the work that I do and the work that I support. Thanks for that question.
Thank you. I mean, I personally feel like I've learned so much from the way that the people in movement talk about their work, because it really is, I can't emphasize enough, just from a like political theory standpoint, but like philosophical standpoint, what a big break it is, right? Like it's a big change. Because for me, what I heard you say is that this work has to be in service of relationships, right? The relationships that you have with the people that you're serving, right? The relationship that you have with yourself, the relationship that you have with institutions, right? Instead of in service of an ideology, right? Or an abstract idea.
Absolutely.
And for me, that is so critically important, because I think that no matter how, good the ideology is, like whatever good politics is, if what you're in service to is an abstract idea, it's too easy to burn yourself out, to succumb to zealotry or rigidness, or be satisfied with symbolic actions that are not effective. But if you have this paradigm where the question is, how is this in service to the relationships that we actually have in our lived experience in the world, then you have a whole different orientation toward the work. And I think that is very exciting, not only for organizers, which it is, but think about how politics in general is transformed, right? Is changed. If it's about creating capacity for healthy relationships, right? Between people, but also between people and institutions, right? Rather than about abstract ideas about what society is or should be, right? Like, it just gives you so much more room to imagine, right? But it also makes you more effective. And here's the funny thing is that for me, as a pragmatist, I'm philosophically a pragmatist. It doesn't mean my politics are not radical, but for me, what's so awesome about all this emphasis on care and healing and hearts and relationships is that it's actually the most effective way to go about doing things.
Absolutely.
And I think we miss that, right? And that's one thing I want to like highlight and bring out is like actually, guys, this works best.
Absolutely. Those relationships, and I know I'm like in between, like I know this is the conversation about Black Lives Matter, but even as we approach in Labor Day, you know what I mean, and thinking about my experience in organizing, it's why I moved into you know, doing this work from the environmental justice and climate justice work, organizing work. I shifted from labor because of those different things. Like I felt like I was committed to the ideology of democracy and, you know, the ideology around like having a union, but then the other side of it is like those some of those same systems being in place that looks exactly like the thing that we're trying to not recreate. And a lot of the successes that we saw were because of personal relationships, you know, that were built, like going to some of the workers, like kids events, or, you know, finding ways to really like feel a need rather than get a card or a signature. And so that is like critically one of the reasons why I shifted my organizing, because I was feeling burnt out. I was feeling like my work was not having meaning because I had no, the container in which I was organizing in didn't see beyond, didn't see the need to, you know, invest in the building of those relationships. And so, yeah, just wanted to add that, like,
Yeah,
as another piece.
yeah, and to build on to this idea of doing this work in service of relationships, I'm wondering if both of you can just talk a little bit about the role that geography plays in this, and really place-based work, right? So there's a real component to place-based work in environmental justice work and climate justice work. And likewise, it seems also in Black Lives Matter, like we very much identify Ferguson, Missouri as a place, right? And it was those long-term relationships in those places that have made a difference. And so if you could speak a little bit more to kind of geography and place-basedness in the work.
You want to go, Monica? Why don't you say why you moved from Chicago to Mississippi?
That's what I'm like. I'm sitting here thinking, and I'm just like thinking about that transition, because my experience in Chicago was so different, but also, yeah, I was a lot younger, and I felt like my family did a great deal to kind of protect us from, you know, different things. But I feel like the whole entire world is starting to see how like Mississippi feels, and the lines are really becoming blurred between like the issues from the north to the south. But in thinking about the South, you know, the history of the Confederacy and, you know, white supremacy, all these threads are really like the fabric of what this country has been built upon. And so we look at, you know, Black and African people who were enslaved, you know, these different forms of oppression have continued to kind of carry out through wage suppression. In Mississippi, we're still at $7.25 an hour. You talk about voter suppression, the policing of Black and brown neighborhoods, access to transportation, like access to internet, you know, in rural communities having those same accesses, food and healthcare. And so, you know, when I think about what geography's role is, I moved to the South because I felt like this is where the work really needed to be done. I felt more, honestly, more free in the North. It's crazy that we still use this language to say like that we are not free on paper. And actually, Mississippi did not abolish officially on the books slavery until I want to say it was my freshman year of college. So that was just like 2000s. Um, so you know that is the history that I ran to because I felt like this is where you know the most one the richest culture. You know that this when you look at I've gone to so many museums in different places and Mississippi is always on the map for that route through the transatlantic slave trade. And so felt I actually don't have family here, but felt a very strong connection to being here and being um, learning about the community. Is a completely different place than where I'm used to being, but have been here for over 10 years now and feel like I would not want to be anywhere else. So when we look at you know, geography, I feel like the South definitely has a lot of those things in place that across the world folks are starting to really feel. Um, and not saying that these oppressions weren't happening like in the North, but I feel like in the South it definitely that extracted the threads of the extractive economy really are really entangled here and very much so more visible than when I lived in the North. And so, you know, the challenges that have, you know, kind of come about is being able to, I would say, remove that fear and intimidation, like white terrorism, and you know all the things that have happened in the past have really, at times, been a point where it has been a point of where folks have not been able to like really forget about those things. You know that seeing your town burnt down or knowing that your grandmother, you know, was a part of uh, helping folks get registered to vote and would, you know, didn't make it back from one of those registration movements. Like, so just so many thoughts, but it's really thick, like to the point where the oppression is in the air. But I'm seeing that it just feels like lines are really blurred right now when it comes to what the experiences are from the North to the South.
Yeah. When I think about geography, I tend to think about federalism. And so kind of building on what Monica said in terms of history, I think that geography is really important because the histories of each place are so distinct and rooted, and people feel connections to those histories in very personal ways. But I also think about the ways that the political work is more effective when it can be federated, right? Which means that people who are in their local areas are trusted to be experts on their local areas and to lead the campaigns, the policies, the agenda setting for that area while being in conversation with people who are also doing the same thing in other areas. So you can create a kind of comprehensive strategy, which is, you know, it's kind of basis for any kind of federated institution is that you have, you know, a kind of overview, large sense of things, but the most important decisions are made locally. And I think that that's the structure of the movement for Black Lives, which I think is actually highly effective, you know, where people have autonomy in their own sort of localities. But then again, it's about this whole question of basing your politics on your lived experience, right? Like, people are often very attached to the places that they live. And when they're not attached, they go find some place that they are attached to, right? Like if they can. And you can kind of see the way this is in even in like popular culture, right? Like there are whole songs that, you know, most of the song is just calling out the place people are from, right? Like it's just like, and everybody gets like very excited, you know what I mean? Like, you know what I mean? It's just like, you know, so that just means something to people. It's a place where they have knowledge and mastery, and where their care networks are. And so it's a natural place for a natural way for the work to be organized, you know, and particularly if you're actually dealing with the land, the actual land, you know, it makes sense to have the most important decisions be localized while in conversation, right, with people who are in other localities, because what happens in one place, of course, always does affect and relate to another place. So that's what I thought. Actually, when you first said that, that was the first thing I thought of. I was just like, I've been at outdoor concerts where all the person does is stand on stage and be like, "Where Brooklyn? Where do, you know what I mean?" And it's like, and everyone's like, "Yeah!" And I'm just like, you know, place matters. It just does.
Absolutely. And taking the leadership from those two that are in that place. And we think about geography. I know one of the ways that we've been exploring, you know, how to build a real like translocal kind of organizing model is exploring, you know, different bioregions, what, you know, how we connected by waterways, those folks being the folks that are most impacted, those that live by the water, being a part of those decisions as they are the most impacted. So just adding that piece about geography, and as we explore, you know, what it means to be in a relationship with a place, like there's so many other things that determine that as well.
So you have both given us so much to talk and chew on, and we have like only like another few minutes left in this part before we go to breakout rooms. So I was wondering if either of you had a question for each other, or we can go to the breakout rooms a little early and then come back and have a little bit more time. So I don't know if there's a burning follow-up either of you have for each other, or we can. No? Okay. Okay. All right. So then at this point, let's, Viveka is going to come on and help set up the breakout rooms, and this will give people a little chance to process and integrate and explore what we've heard. So passing it to Viveka.
Yeah, thank you so much for that conversation. I feel like I had a total unlock for myself. So I'm just personally really like in a moment. So what we want to do is give folks on in this Zoom call a chance to have a conversation about what's lighting up for you. You know, so I'm imagining other people are also having their moments. So what are some of the interesting things you heard in the conversation? That can include things that spark you to be like, yes, or like, well, I don't know about that. Maybe, you know, my lived experience or my politics tells me something a little different. So there's room for that too. And we're curious to just go deeper in the conversation in small groups about how can these lessons that have been explored in this conversation, taking that deeper to just continue the conversation. How can that be applied to the climate disruptions we can see on the horizon? Yeah, just like there are also disruptions to the racist systems, when that intersects with climate disruptions also at the simultaneity, how can these lessons help us be even more powerful and more effective going forward? So what we want to do is ask people who want to be in a breakout group to stay in Zoom. And that's how Maru, who's in the background here, will be able to create the breakout groups for us. And then we're also going to take a 5-minute break so that we can just talk about the theme of care. Yes, like care for our whole embodied selves, so that this event is actually part of your being stronger when you leave. So we're going to take a 5-minute break, take care of yourself, and be back at the top of the hour, wherever your time zone is. And if you're not going to be in breakouts, we would ask that you sign off now to make Maru's life a little easier to create the groups. Yeah. So thank you so much, and we'll be back at the top of the hour, and I will we'll be in full group, and I'll give us more specifics about how the breakouts will run. Thanks, everybody.
So Deva, Monica, and Anna and I were in a breakout room and we're chatting. And so one of the questions that came up, and I thought maybe we could share a little bit about this while folks were chatting, was one of the questions I was intrigued about, Deva and Monica, was this question about bridging between academia and activism. And like, what are this kind of the rich possibilities and potential there? And so maybe you can speak to that while folks are chatting some of their questions for this part of the conversation. Go for it, Monica.
I was like, yeah, okay, I'll start. And then, okay. We were just talking a bit and you know, coming from being a person that, you know, the way that I've been able to communicate and learn, you know, in school and this activist world, you know, in my organizing world, has been through culture. And so, you know, as I have gotten deeper into like different forms of organizing, I know that's not what that's not what leads. Sometimes is very in the box or a script, you know, kind of things that are like put in place that we, you know, honor as the way that things have to happen. And so for someone who, you know, I would say is an artist and organizer, I feel like, you know, culture is how I have been able to lead and communicate and, you know, get folks involved with, you know, whatever it is I'm trying to convince them to do at the moment. And so, you know, that's in thinking about like art and creativity and being able to kind of communicate something that surpasses, that really touches the soul. You know, one of the, I say in climate justice, one of the things that strategies that we try to center within our work is if it's not soulful, it's not strategic. And so that means, you know, really hitting at the core of what is most important to people, what shakes their soul and what moves them towards that type of action. So I'll pass it over to Deva for, you know, for some more jewels.
Well, I just think we can just meditate on that if it's not soulful, it's not strategic. And it really relates to the conversation that I know you, Anna, and Sujatha and I were having, is that's something that people really need to understand, right? About organizing, is that, you know, strategy is not something that's separate from you know, all this kind of relational interaction and cultural production, right? Strategy is embedded in that. And indeed, when we're doing our best work, I think we are, you know, right at the intersection of all those things, right? Being strategic and incorporating people's whole selves, right? As they put it in the movie, right? Like so you can show up with your whole self. But I did want to talk about academy and activists. I personally am very invested in this idea. It's because, I mean, I study social movements, and so my work is really centered on learning from activists and organizers, but I also just think in terms of education and in terms of learning about the world as it is and imagining the world as it might be, or as we would, the world we would like to build, is just a critical intersection that needs to happen, a critical conversation, and a critical piece of knowledge sharing that needs to happen. Because what I find, at least, you know, at the New School a couple of years ago, we were able to bring an activist in residence, Chanel Matthews, to be at the school, who, by the way, still works at our school, right? Like, because she couldn't quit us, it turned out, after she was there, and still is doing like those same organizing work that she was doing. But it's because, you know, activists and practitioners have practice-based knowledge a ton of it, so much of it that the university never gets to tap into. And so we are poorer for that. But at the same time, universities create a space for reflection and thought that activists and organizers usually don't have access to. And so it creates a space for them for that. So it's really a mutually beneficial relationship that we don't support enough, right? Because organizers and people on the ground have all this knowledge that would enrich our educational environment so much. And universities have all this space that organizers and activists could use to deepen their own sort of knowledge of their knowledge, if that makes sense to you, right? Like to deepen their own connection of like, oh yeah, I know that, right? Like, and to reflect, you know, more fully. I just always find it so exciting. I find it so exciting to be in conversation.
Thank you. Go ahead.
No, I was just to add on to what Deva just said, like, is that the culture piece is not, you know, the add-on is how we organize for the impact, you know, that we're trying to build towards, that we are building towards. So just thinking about, you know, some different ways that culture, I've seen culture shared in spaces as kind of a add-on or as a performative thing, but it at the end of the day definitely is one of those things that gets us the results that we are looking for as we're building for the new world.
So one of the questions that came up from the breakout rooms was a question around fear. And when I think about, you know, sometimes it's very easy to use the words disruption and contention, but really at the heart of it is risk-taking. And there's so much about art that is also about risk-taking, right? It's about putting out something that is so personal and so vulnerable. And it is about also being in relationship with each other. And so I'm wondering if both of you could say a little bit about like the role of risk and fear in both relationship building, but also in art making and in that kind of community building that goes to the heart of like ways in which we disrupt the script and like get, you know, like I loved what you said earlier, Deva, about knocking people off their script. Like it's a risky thing to do, whether you're doing it for your, like, you know, in the world in terms of art or in terms of relationship.
I feel like you should start as an artist, Monica, you know, because I'm actually really risk averse. So,
Most definitely. I'm just thinking about, you know, from in this question, I'm unpacking it for myself, and I'm thinking about what like risk and fear in relationship to relationship. I think we have to be able to be unapologetic, be open and willing to be in relationship with each other. And what that, you know, and to do that deeply means to for lack of better words, be able to tell your comrades they might have shit on their shirt. But that we are working together to get that off, you know, to get that clean. But it really means being able to be human, be humane, understand where folks are coming from, but also be able to have respect enough and mutual respect enough to be held accountable to one another. So, and I'm thinking about like risk and fear because and this is from, you know, from a perspective of, you know, being a Black woman in many spaces where there aren't many of us. You know, it does require a bit of like risk taking and being able to share those things that you obviously are able to see more closely with your eye, and without, you know, without even, you know, that is those are these, like, I would say like microaggressions or different things that Black people have to endure in trying to do the good work. And so for me, risk taking and fear looks like being able to be vulnerable, with our experiences, and where we also need to build muscle and understanding. And then just from the perspective of art, like definitely my I would say my role as an artist is to be vulnerable when I write. Take that process as a where it's almost like I go into meditation, you know, with myself before even creating that thing to share with the world. And so, you know, and that's being willing to take risk with yourself to be able to share those things and see how it reverberates. Like other people, and art is so amazing that people can look at the same thing or hear the same thing and hear different things at the same time. And so that's one of the, I feel like, most beautiful outcomes of like taking risk and being vulnerable and sharing your art, creating your art, and being open enough with self to be able to impart that knowledge to folks.
For me, this brings up so many things because, as I said, I'm a risk-averse person. That's my personality. But it's also, I think, all right, you guys are just gonna have to work with me for a while because I'm just sort of thinking on the fly and I might get philosophical. But I'm definitely gonna get philosophical. So, but here's the thing. So I think that risk aversion is a part of my personality, but it's also a symptom of trying to be a successful Black woman in neoliberalism, right? So, because I know that I don't get any more chances. Like I have to get it right the first time or I'm screwed, right? And that doesn't mean just like professionally, that can mean unto death, right? Like that means like, so everything is very high risk. Or seems very high risk for me because of the social, political, and economic context that we live in. So I think a lot of people who are type A, right, which is this, you know, like people who are like very goal-oriented and driven are also risk averse because we actually live in a society that doesn't give us very much room for risk at all, right? Because we can't fail because we won't have another chance. There's no support. There's no, you know, kind of surrounding context of care and uplift and love. So I think that one of the things that studying the movement has done for me, who's a very, like, you guys don't understand, like my orientation toward the world is not like a kind of like woo-woo hip, like I don't, like that is not the way that I am in the world. But learning from this movement, I understand that it's all connected, right? It's all connected because the whole thing about you have to be able to risk in order to create something new. And so then this whole thing about the politics of care in the movement and the thing about relationships and the thing about accountability, all of that is trying to create a context where risk doesn't mean that you're not safe, right? It means, you know what I'm saying? Like where you can risk, where you can be wrong, where you can, you know, fail at something, right? But it doesn't mean that you're not safe. And that means both internally in organizations, but also externally, right? Like the whole thing about, you know, creating an infrastructure for people who are arrested at action so that we can make sure that they have legal support and that we can get them out of jail and, you know, funds so that if they have like a loss of work or a loss of, you know, income because of these actions, right? It's creating a context in which people can be safe, can take risks more safely. Because we live in a society in which it is very, very unsafe, especially for some people. And for most people, right? Basically, unless you have money and you are a white man, it is super, super unlikely that you're going to be getting second chances to do things, right? And so, yeah, so I'm just thinking about how all of this is connected and how the idea of vulnerability is not just a kind of, you know, a soft idea about, you know, not that it would, but you know what I mean? Like, I think that there's a way of thinking like, this is like about your emotions, right? Like, you know what I mean? And it is about our emotions, but it's also, you know, we can't transform the world into a place where everyone has what they need unless we actually take seriously what people need, right? And what we need is more than material, right? we also need a space in which it's okay to try and fail and not feel like you'll be destroyed if that happens.
Yeah, I mean, this is such an interesting conversation because in some ways it's the ultimate paradox of this kind of change that we seek in the world, right? So, and I think particularly about Black Lives Matter, which is in many ways, is the group that is the most vulnerable, that are the ones that are out in the street and protesting and disrupting the sort of racial status quo in the United States. And so, you know, as we think about like, how do we create these, and there was a question that came from the small groups around sort of emotional resonance. So there's both an emotional resonance around risk-taking and vulnerability and bravery, also like the incredible bravery that happens. Yeah, and so maybe like the, you know, the flip side of talking about risk is also to talk about courage and bravery. And maybe Monica, you can share some last thoughts on that as we wrap up this section, given what you see in communities every day and on the ground.
Yeah. Yeah, and just thinking about like community defense, and some of what Deva just mentioned about having that safety net and being on the front lines. So those folks that speak up the most, that are disruptive, you know, to and seeking radical change, are the ones who are on the front lines. And so most of the time we talk about like not having, not replicating neoliberalism. These are, you know, these are the things that where folks really stand out. And I'm thinking about the place in which I am in Mississippi. Those that are often looked at, you have your kind of progressive liberals, and then you have like your really, really left, like radical people. And those people are often separated from what the mass, you know, thinks change looks like. And often put them, you know, these are also the folks that are often calling out the things that, you know, the neoliberal system is upholding. And so that does put a target on your back. That does put you at more risk for, you know, for attack. When I think about our just this past May Day, we had done a you know, everything went virtual. Okay, so everybody's figuring out what that looks like. And so locally, well, there was actually a national call that was led by again, my home organization, Cooperation Jackson, and where we had some folks who hacked into the Zoom call, and during the call, a lot of racial slurs were belted out. They even took over the screen and was showing different, you know, different things that, you know, obviously would upset, you know, a person from seeing those things. And so, you know, there's just thinking about a lot of things in my mind about like how there has to be a plan for what community looks like and supporting itself. You know, I think about Fannie Lou and folks who were driving to the rural communities to do the voter registrations. And those folks knew that like if that car didn't make it back by a certain time, they knew exactly where they were. They knew who to call and to say, if you don't have them out at home by this time, we're going to go here. Like having a plan in place to be supportive when, you know, we have to be our own protectors.
Yeah, well, thank you. So we wanted to end with sharing some art and poetry. But before I do that, I wanted to give another plug for, so this is the second in a series of 5 conversations. We have another 3 coming up, and maybe we can put the link for the remaining conversations in the chat box. And also just to remind folks that we are really using these conversations to inform the design of a fellowship. It's going to be a 2-year fellowship for environmental justice leaders. So for those of you who are interested in this, please stay abreast of what we are doing. And with that, for these last minutes, I want to pass the mic to Monica to share a poem that she has written.
And can we take this share screen off so we can see? Yeah, that'd be great.
Thank y'all again for making space for this sharing. Thank you everybody that's online that took Friday this time, these 2 hours Friday to join in. And so I just want to share something original that I wrote called Wage and War, and I hope that it speaks for itself. Revolution gonna have to be unionized, but don't have to be televised, because it's coming to you live and live in color. And no commercials will air, so stay tuned if you're alive. See, my brown skin's been called sin since back when the complexities of our complexions matched with the sun. Days when we were labeled by our nation's tribe, but they called us black to hold us back from the truth of our spiritual light, but the righteous know who we are. Protesting for justice on street corners, while corners contact mothers to confirm that really was your baby face down in the street. Children of Judah become familiar with your worth when the world reduces you to -3/5. In a time when corporations speak louder than their actions, are you ready to live like gods, then move towards action? For Black life more than matters. That's why we're fed daily manna, and our pigmentation is a combination of God's hand mixed with the earth and the sun. They commonly ask why we walk slow, for we are the inherited military that was never told to run. So ask yourself, are you ready for the war? But not the one of the flesh though. I'm talking the one against principalities that came with a dark and motivated wickedness, when spiritual warfare breaks over our heads like bills and clouds, black bodies stacked in the streets like hills and mounds. If we must die, let it not be like hogs or hounds. For our beings are essential. Beauty that came from a holy lamb. So when light strikes light, see, we be a holy man. Waging war on behalf of Trayvon, Mike Brown, Jonathan Sanders, hell, all of them unarmed but equally Black. So next time you hear that clap, go ahead and assume that we strapped. Standing fearless against intimidation. See, a nation has a rise that will shoot back. I said a nation has a rise that will shoot back. I said a nation has a rise that will shoot back. Are you ready for the war? For this is the new Black initiative. Thank you. And thank you for all the virtual claps and snaps. I feel them all the way over here.
Thank you, Monica. And also thank you, Deva, for joining us. And thank you all for the folks online.
Thank you.
Yes. Take good care for the rest of your day and have a good weekend, all.